In this video, I've teamed up with a fellowship of some of the best crafters on YouTube to make the biggest terrain project in YouTube history, a massive miniature Minas Tirith, the White City of Gondor. This project is the brainchild of Lachlan from the channel Zorpazorp.
Greetings guys!
An absolute madman who some of you may know as the preeminent creator of Lord of the Rings tabletop content on YouTube, and a tremendous crafter and terrain builder as well. Lachie has convinced a bunch of other creators like myself to build him buildings for the project and mail them to Australia for him to assemble into one massive board. Now I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan, and a big fan of Lachie as well, so today I'm going to show you what I built for him. Let's get to it. The first time I saw the Lord of the Rings movies, I was a young kid in theaters around the holidays, and I was unbelievably impressed and inspired by the settings on screen. I had read Lord of the Rings as a kid, and while most of the world existed in my imagination, the jumping off point for that imaginary world was the cover of the books that I had, gorgeous illustrations by the talented John Howe. I particularly remember this one, which features a Nazgul on a fell beast in front of a massive structure which I think is supposed to be Barad-dûr, the stronghold of Sauron. I remember as a child looking at this illustration and feeling a pang of fear and wonder at this impossible, fantastic tower, grounded in realistic architecture, yet unbelievably high. Now the reason I bring this up is because a lot of the time when you see your favorite books translated to the silver screen, they come up short. But for me, Lord of the Rings was an exception. When I saw Minas Tirith on screen, looming up over the Pelennor fields, it felt just like I had imagined it. It had the same sense of imposing height that the John Howe illustration from my book cover had. A good sense of setting can take a story from an afternoon of entertainment to a memory that will stick with you forever. Peter Jackson, I think, understood this. So before any filming was done on The Lord of the Rings, talented artists spent years designing and building the sets that Tolkien had created. John Howe himself was among them, but Minas Tirith specifically was created by Alan Lee and the Weta Workshop studio, who created a spectacular miniature at 72mm scale. This bigature was used for some of the sweeping camera shots and left a real impression on me. And because the city was so memorable and so much effort went into it having its own unique aesthetic, I wanted my design to feature some of the same stylistic elements that make Minas Tirith a distinctive and identifiable city. So with the movie as our guide, let's start building this piece. First of all, I have a vivid memory of Gandalf riding Shadowfax up the winding streets, under round archways that span the road. So for sure we need an archway that Gandalf can ride beneath. I decided to accomplish this by making a colonnaded walkway with arched windows that will act as a connection between two structures. To make this shape, I started by sketching the outline on some paper. I used a Soldier of Gondor miniature to make sure the scale was about what I wanted it to be, then cut out these paper templates with scissors. I transferred the shapes to some insulation foam by tracing over the lines with a pencil. Then cut out the shapes using my Proxxon cutter. There are more sophisticated ways to do this using jigs and special tools, but I decided to just go slowly and do my best to follow the line I had drawn. This left the inside of my arches with this rough, ribbed sort of texture, which can easily be removed by wrapping some sandpaper around a cylindrical object and gently sanding it smooth. While I was at it, I cut a bunch of large blocks of foam to block out the main structures of my building. I opted for a tower on one side and a more traditional house shape on the other. Both towers and tiled roofs are a distinctive part of the Minas Tirith skyline, and I wanted both. The buildings of Minas Tirith are made of tightly mortared, finely dressed stone, made with exquisite craftsmanship. To get these fine, even courses of stonework, I'll simply etch mortar lines into the foam faces. You'll see more on this later. I glued the basic shapes of the buildings together using Gorilla Glue construction adhesive, which is in my opinion the best way to bond layers of foam. I'm keeping all the large pieces separate though, because this will help later in painting and will also make it easier to pack this thing up in a box and ship it to Lachie when it's finished. I sanded the edges of the blocks as well. Sanding leaves a flat surface, but it also leaves these fluffy bits everywhere, and these need to go. So with a gentle pass of my heat gun, I melt them away and leave a smooth surface. I added some buttresses to the tower to break up the blocky shape. Then measuring with a ruler, I made even rows of large stone blocks, tracking the design with a pencil, then deepening the grooves with an X-Acto knife. Buttresses are another one of those iconic stylistic elements from Minas Tirith. But a word of advice: if you plan to build a tower using this method, carve the stone lines first, then add the buttresses. Do I wish I'd done that?
Yes. I wish that.
I mark out where I want the doors and windows, then carve up the masonry to look like they're built into the stonework naturally. The whole building gets done up in a nice stonework pattern of various sizes. This variation suggests the different eras and architects that contributed to this ancient city. I particularly enjoyed this, slicing up under an edge to get a nice clean window. Most of them I had to sort of pick out with a knife. For the windows, I used some Lego windows that I bought on eBay. They have a nice arched shape and a leaded diamond pattern already built in, so they're perfect. I cut this little loop off the top with a knife, but I'll save that for later because it'll be useful. To add more interest to the street level, I built a covered porch type area with more circular arches. Now this will look nice with a few barrels down there and will make the city streets feel more lived in and less canyon-like. The circular arches and windows are a huge part of the aesthetic, so I wanted to make a nice circular top door that'll look like it belongs. I start by cutting the outline of chipboard, then applying coffee stir sticks with hot glue. Once these are solidly in place, I trim around the outside with a pair of kitchen shears. With the tip of a compass, I score some wood grain into the door. I could add wooden cross braces, but there are a lot of ironwork details in Minas Tirith, so instead I mix up some 2-part green stuff epoxy putty and sculpt some iron brackets. I also made a door handle using the bit of Lego window I saved from before and a little bit more putty. I think this adds a bit more fine detail as befits a city with the high craftsmanship standard of Minas Tirith. I use the tip of a compass to poke some nail holes, and when it's dry, that's my door. I actually need 4 doors, some of which won't be very visible, so I decided to just make some copies of this door. I mixed up some silicone mold making putty and then pressed that onto my door to make a mold. When that was finished, I used some oven-baked Sculpey clay to make a copy. The really cool thing about these silicone molds is they can withstand the temperatures inside your oven, so oven-baked clay is a quick way to make copies of things. With those doors made, I test fit them into the doorways I have carved around the piece. They fit snugly. Great. I made a set of stairs to get to the main floor, starting with a grid pattern, then cutting the treads with a hot wire foam cutter. This adds some interesting levels and more shapes to the building. I love these structures that seemingly cling to the walls of Minas Tirith, so I wanted to pay homage to their design with an oriel window on the front of my building. I used Lego windows, and for some masonry supports I cut a piece of foam with the same method as the stairs, then cut some thin slices to make several masonry features. Techniques like this slicing are one of the huge advantages of working with a hot wire foam cutter. Back to the roofline. As I mentioned, I'm keeping this in separate pieces for shipping, but there's this awkward little gap here, so I cut a little wedge and dropped that in. Sorted. Another iconic Minas Tirith thing is these stepped gables called crow-stepped gables. I put those on for another little stylistic cue from the movie version. Once the gables are on, I tile the roof with some cardboard tiles, stuck on with some Allianz tacky glue, and make sure to alternate the gaps in the tiles for a more realistic effect. For the roof of the tower section, I sandwich a square bit of foam between 2 slightly larger pieces of chipboard. Then I make some stepped corner crenellations with pink foam. I deliberately left a gap in the parapet so it could accommodate a trebuchet. Stick around to the end of the video to see that. To add some masonry detail, I glued a bunch of foam wedges into the gap between the layers of the chipboard. This gives a nice detail carved look without too much effort, which I'm really pleased with. I carved some mortar lines into the masonry as a final detail. To get a realistic texture, I press a stone into the stonework that I've already carved. This leaves an impression of a rough, coarse masonry texture. And just like that, this thing is ready to paint. I come in first with a heavy layer of gesso, which is kind of like a liquid plaster used for priming canvases. It gives a really nice, smooth, matte white finish, which is perfect for the White City. When that's finished, I come with a variety of spray cans, hitting the structure with 2 shades of gray, then pure white from directly above. This will give some shadow and some natural variation. The doors and windows I painted separately, priming them black and then picking out the metal details with the gunmetal paint. The doors got a gray dry brush to pick out the details. The roofs were painted a nice slate gray, then given a dark wash to add contrast and variation. It looks pretty sweet up to this point, but it's too clean. In the movies you can see streaks of grime, filth, and dust built up from its function as, a low-tech city that uses beasts of burden. I used some mineral spirits and some oil paints to mix up a gray wash and apply it generously to the white areas of stonework. This adds even more depth and variation to the color while still leaving the stones mostly white. It is the White City after all. Now it's starting to look pretty awesome, but it just feels a bit sterile. So with a tiny bit of raw umber paint on my brush, I start adding some filthy streaks. In a city without modern plumbing, where people use wood as fuel and beasts of burden roam the streets, things get dirty. You can use your imagination as to what these streaks represent, but they look pretty good. I also scrubbed this brown around the bottom of the structures, and all of a sudden, it looks much more realistic. I did a final light gray dry brush to pick out some of the detail on the roof, and this piece is done. I'm totally stoked with how it ended up, and a little bit sad that I have to send it to Lachlan, but it gives me comfort to know it's going to be part of such a cool, massive piece of wargaming history. Since making this miniature, it's arrived successfully in Australia and been integrated with the rest of the board. Make sure to click on the links in the description to the other collaborators in this challenge to see the entire board in its completion. Hopefully one day I'll be able to visit down under where Lachlan is and play a game or two on this board. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A huge thank you to all my patrons for all your continued support. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.